Hey everyone, we'll be starting in a second. I'm just waiting for the other panelists to join us. Mr. McKnight.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Pete. All right, it looks like everyone is here. All of our panelists are here. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for logging on to our panel discussion called The Penalty. Just a little background, we are Amplify Caribbean. We're an NGO based in Antigua and Barbuda with members from all around the Caribbean. And our NGO was actually founded by Ashanti O'Keefe and Saeed Graham. We generally facilitate social campaigns on an array of topics such as entrepreneurship, mental health, regional integration, as well as creating a network of young professionals in the Caribbean. So currently, we're engaged in a project on the death penalty with Greater Caribbean for Life. And today's panel discussion was actually organized with the support of the World's Coalition Against the Death Penalty, funded by the European Union. So we want to say thanks to them for sponsoring the event. So our panel discussion today is on providing a informative approach about the death penalty here in Antigua and Barbuda. So we have our four amazing panelists who are with us tonight. So I'm just going to introduce them briefly before we start the discussion. So we have with us, and I'm not going in any particular order, going randomly. So our first panelist is RoseMary Reynolds. Now, RoseMary is a graduate of the University of the West Indies, Cape Hill campus. and she's a current student at the Norman Manley Law School. Now, RoseMary is extremely passionate about volunteering, and this passion was nurtured at the Antigua Girls High School and the Antigua State College, where she also noticed the lack of availability of volunteering opportunities in Antigua. Now, with this in mind, in 2018, she co-founded Youth Today to meet that need. Now, Youth Today is a nonprofit organization geared towards creating new opportunities for Antiguan youth, mainly through creating community service activities for young persons. So for her efforts and contributions to Youth Today, RoseMary was actually awarded by Her Majesty the Queen with a Commonwealth Point of Light Award. I know she didn't really want me to mention this, but I think it's a big deal, so I'm going to big up RoseMary on that. And thank you, RoseMary, for being a part of our panel. Now, up next, we have Nneka Nicholas. Now, Nneka is passionate about the environment and creating a world where people of all genders feel respected in their bodies. Now, Nneka has a bachelor's in law from the University of the West Indies, and she is currently a student at the Norman Manley Law School in Jamaica, pursuing her legal education certificate. She's currently employed at the Department of Environment for the last 5 years, and Nneka is actually a co-founder of Intersect Antigua, through which she has been allowed to participate in outreach to high schools, college-age students about the importance of consent, human trafficking, and respecting personal boundaries. And it has even allowed her to work closely with the Directorate of Gender Affairs, most notably to organize Orange Rally for the opening of the 16 Days of Activism in 2015. Now, Nneka is very vocal about police brutality against vulnerable members of society, homophobia, and domestic violence. She's currently serving as secretary on the board of a newly formed nonprofit organization in Seattle, Washington, HER, whose main goal is to provide sanitary products to persons experiencing homelessness who have their periods. So I want to thank you, Nneka, for being a part of our panel as well. Up
Thanks
next,
for having me.
yeah, sure, no problem. Up next, we have the guys. So I'll start first with Kadeem Joseph. Now, Kadeem Joseph is a United Nations gender advocate and youth activist with a passion for youth development. He's an aspiring medical practitioner with undergraduate degrees in health science. Kadeem also has over 10 years of experience where he has worked, 10 years of experience, sorry, in media, where he has worked as a producer, reporter, and radio show host. Kadeem is also a media consultant and promotes voluntary blood donations with the Red Cross group Club Life. So thank you, Kadeem, for joining us this evening. Can you hear me, Kadeem?
Yes, thanks for having
Okay.
me.
Okay, great. And last but definitely not least, we have Pete-Semaj McKnight. Now, Pete is an attorney at law called into practice in two jurisdictions, Jamaica and Antigua and Barbuda. He has been practicing law for a little under 4 years now and also functions as a litigator. His areas of practice include, but are not limited to, criminal, civil, and immigration. Pete also functions as a co-host of a radio program called Life, Law, and Music, LLM, which covers different areas of life with a little law and music. So thank you for joining us as well, Pete. Now that would be a little background on our panel. As you can see, they're very qualified. So these are the persons that we'll be speaking to for the next hour about the death penalty. So I just want to go straight into it. And my first question is actually for RoseMary. Now, RoseMary, I want us to kind of frame the discussion. So can you provide some clarity on what is the legal definition of the death penalty?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Okay, all right. So thank you once again for inviting to this panel, and good night to the other panelists. So basically, a very simple definition of the death penalty is that it is the lawful execution of death as a punishment for a criminal offense. And this criminal offense is a very serious criminal offense, meaning treason or murder. And even in our Constitution, we have it under Section 4, I think, that no person shall deprived of his life intentionally, save for execution of the sentence of a court in respect of a crime of treason or murder. So that's basically what death penalty is.
All right, thank you, Rosemary, for that definition. So my next question is going to be for each of the panelists. Now, oftentimes we have heard different arguments in favor of the death penalty. So what are some common arguments that you've heard in favor of the death penalty? We can just start with anyone who's willing to go first.
Okay, I'll go first.
Sure.
One of the most common justifications I've heard for the death penalty is people looking at it as a way for revenge for the person who, the victim of the crime. So, you know, the death penalty is reserved for the most heinous of crimes on legislation. So you have like murder, treason, and I've heard people who are for the death penalty say that, you know, it's revenge. You're looking at justice in a vengeful or retributive sort of fashion rather than in, you know, that justice is supposed to be rehabilitative. So there's also some people who don't believe that criminals can be rehabilitated, that there is no rehabilitatory part of justice. So they would prefer that, you know, the death penalty be executed. I've heard the scenario where people are just like, you know, if my family member was murdered by somebody, I would want them to face the death penalty. So people look at it in a personal scope without, you know, considering that the other person is also a human and that person also has family members that they would be leaving behind, or, you know, they just don't take into consideration that the fact that the other person is also a person.
Okay, so you would say that one of the
I'd like
most
to add
common
that,
arguments is revenge.
Yeah.
Yes.
Retribution. I'd like to add to that as well, that
Sure.
not only retribution, but look at it as a deterrent factor. They were saying, well, if the death penalty is on the books, if it's being done or being executed by the state, most persons wouldn't be committing certain acts. Or they would say, well, if they had this on the book, I don't think these murders would be happening. We wouldn't having these violent crimes. We wouldn't be having persons going above and beyond, especially doing these acts. So we have retribution that is on the books. Then we have the deterrent factor that persons have, and then we actually, I think one of the third, I would add a third one. I think is moral. The moral opinion or the thing coming from the Bible. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth principle. That because this happened, then you are punished for what you did. The life for life, in essence. So where it comes, you have the one from the personal aspect, where it's retribution, vendetta or vengeance. Then you would have it for the deterrent aspect, which I just outlined. If we had it on the books or if it was being executed, persons would not be committing these acts. And I added the third one, it coming originally from the moral aspect, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth principle. Those are the three arguments I think I could posit.
Okay, Rosemary, I see you nodding along. Do you have anything that you would also like to add?
Yes. Basically what Nneka and Pete-Semaj has said, yeah, that's basically the same points that I've picked up on, like, you know, discussions here and there, especially like when you have conversations with older people and the type of things they would say, and like, well, you know, so and so wanted to happen if them two gonna hang people. Like basically that's the type of view that people have of the death penalty, as Samaj would have said, that it's a deterrent. So if we still executed people, these type of crimes would not have been committed. And especially the severity of the crime. Like I was having a discussion with someone and they were like, well, you know, if somebody come into my house and kill me while I'm sleeping, you know, they shouldn't be walking right. That people bring it back to like a personal, okay, if it happened to me, it happened to a family member, without also considering, which I understand and I sympathize with, and you know, probably sometimes I may kind of be like that, but also people don't understand that it's not something that happens like in a vacuum. There's so many different factors that encourage people to commit crimes, the socioeconomic status, things like that. So it's not necessarily like people are inherently evil. It's just sometimes it's like the situations that they're in. But at the end of the day, they're also human. So.
Okay, Kadeem, what are some arguments that you have heard for the death penalty?
I think the panelists have covered them pretty extensively. The whole aspect of morality and where we come from in terms of a moral standing. Death penalty has a lot to do with our religious views, and I'm sure most of us in here have heard it often said that Antigua and Barbuda is a Christian community. And quite often when these major discussions come up, you see many individuals in the public take the biblical or the quote-unquote Christian route in these arguments. And as Pete said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And quite recently, I think we had a clergyman on the same death penalty issue mentioned the very same thing. If it is a case where someone has done something that's egregious, the Bible, in his view, is very clear on what should be done. That is, that the other individual's life should be taken. So I think outside of those three that have been covered, I'm not sure that there's anything else.
Okay, I have a question specifically for you now, Kadeem. You would have spoken a lot about persons considering Antigua, a Christian state, and touched a lot on public perception. Now, do you think over the last 5 years, do you think that there has been more or less public awareness on the death penalty over the last 5 years?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure in the sense that the death penalty only recently came up again during the agitation for a probe into the death of Nigel Christian here in Antigua and Barbuda. And of course, Scotland Yard did, based on the government, disclose that they would not be assisted if they did not get that assurance that the death penalty would not have been sought. So I think the debate was reignited this year because of that investigation and what that investigation would have meant for Antigua and Barbuda. Outside of that, I don't think that we discuss it unless we are put in a place where the question is directly in front of us. So I don't think people care until it is them that is in the situation. If it's their family member that was murdered or their family member that has been put up for the death penalty, I don't think otherwise people care.
Okay, fair enough. But what I want to ask you now, having said that, okay, it's not really a discussion until it's on the table or until somebody maybe important it happens to or something like that. What role do you think does the press play in the public's conception of the death penalty?
Well, that's a good question, Lehana.
I know.
The press, especially in Antigua, has a very big voice and is very influential because we still have a wide cross section of the population who listens to talk radio and listens to the news and pays attention and trusts the news that is put out, whether it be from whatever organization. The fact is, a lot of people pay attention to the organization that they trust, and whatever the news that's coming out of that body is almost trusted empirically. There's barely any questioning of the news that is coming from the organization that you deem to be the most trustworthy organization. So I think that the media does play a huge role. Quite often, we report on things in sort of a hands-off way and sort of convict people before they have been tried. Our language, I think we need to have a bit more sensibility about what we see, even the monikers we put on individuals who have been investigated for various crimes. We have to find a way to ensure that we are not trying the issue before the issue even gets to the court. So the media does have a huge role to play in how individuals who are accused of crimes are perceived. And I think the final outcome, in the sense that the media helps to educate the wider populace and helps to inform their sensibilities about these very sensitive issues. So it's a huge role that the media plays in Antigua and Barbuda
I'd
at
like to
least.
add to Mr. Joseph's sentiments about the media. I have sectionalized the media in three platforms. We have the paper, we have the radio or the news that is played, and we have the talk show host. But we need to remember that social media is a means of information and a means of things getting around. And as he said, that in that space, in the social media space, where information is passed, canvassed, opinions are shared, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, um, or even the WhatsApp itself, because sometimes that's how news travels quickly. Either someone sharing a status or somebody forwarding messages constantly. And in those are the spaces and shapes where things can get out of hand in terms of trying things or person's opinions coming from there. But those are the vacuums in which information is passed. And I do believe when persons discuss and forget about the formal means of the media, I'm talking about the informal means, which either be the Twitter, the WhatsApp, the Facebook. That's where the public expresses their views and their opinion. The education doesn't really come from that space because those are just expressing their views, opinion, whether it be in their sense politically correct, legally correct, or sensibly correct. They will just express their opinions on that factor. So I guess more public forums, whether this platform or even ABS or other talk show hosts having persons to come and speak more about it, and even having public forums such as at rallies, but we can't have them now. So I guess we are in this space and this medium, using this platform to educate them on the issues at hand in relation to the death penalty, the reason why it's present, the reason why it's not being executed, and if so, can it be put on back, or is it or should it be or should the status quo of it not being executed remain?
Okay, so I think from what both of you would have said, I can understand that the media would play a significant role in how the public conceptualizes the death penalty, what they think about the topic, what they know about the topic. But my question goes back to Kadeem again. What role should the media play? Should the media have such a significant impact on persons' conception of the death penalty?
I mean, that's an interesting question. Should they? I think in Antigua we respect media entities to a large extent. Should they be the main influence in our conceptualization of the death penalty? No. I think there should be there should be different avenues through which individuals make their conclusions or have their conclusions arrived at about the death penalty. So I guess in one sense, I believe, yes, the media should play a huge role because you want to have responsible media. You want to have access to people like RoseMary and Nneka coming onto various talk shows to help inform the public. And I want to believe, well, at least in my view, and Pete, of course, these are all responsible, well-informed individuals in my estimation. So in that sense, the media should help to inform the greater public about what to feel and what should be the driving forces behind their feelings towards the death penalty. But I think I have to put a caveat there because not all media is good media. Not every show is a good show. We have a lot of radio hosts out there who are uninformed and underinformed that a lot of people listen to. And so I think the public, the audience has to be discerning when it comes to who they listen to. So I think while I would say yes, they should, you also have to have some sort of responsibility and discernment when you're trying to figure out where you get information from.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Kadeem. I want to just go back to another question that I have for all of the panelists. So we touched on some common arguments in favor of the death penalty. Now, what are some common arguments you've heard against the death penalty? I suppose we can start with Nneka.
Sure. One of the most common arguments I've heard against the death penalty is that it is essentially state-sponsored murder. It is state-sanctioned. There's a state-sanctioned execution of a person. So the state is exercising its power to kill someone. It's cruel. I've heard that it's cruel. It's inhumane. The amount of time that persons spend on death row is also cruel and inhumane. Earlier today, there was a panel by Wider Caribbean. I can't remember the name of the organization, but there was an exoneree by the name of Juan Melendez. He spent 17 years, 6 months, and 1 day awaiting the death penalty, and he was that was for a crime that he did not commit. Like in the 16th year of his sentence of him sitting on death row, they found the transcript of the person who actually confessed to the murder. And when he was eventually released, he said his mom told him that every year she would put up money for when they eventually executed him so that they could repatriate his body back to Puerto Rico. So this man was sitting on death row for 17 years. He said because he was on death row, it was just down the way from the execution chamber, and he always knew when somebody was being executed because the lights would flicker. He could smell the electricity, he could smell the person being executed. So things like that. It is the situations, those kind of conditions that persons on death row are sitting in are horrible. Our last death row exoneree, somebody whose his life sentence was committed in 2016, I believe. He said that he was measured for a coffin, and the coffin sat outside his cell for a couple of months. He narrowly escaped, being executed, and this was in Antigua and Barbuda. So things like that, those kind of mind games, that kind of cruelty, that is, to me, is, well, as you can see, which team I'm for. I'm against the death penalty. Those kind of conditions that you're having death row inmates sitting in and dealing with, those kind of mental and psychological abuses, in my opinion, that is cruel and inhumane. And also, as I said, it's state-sponsored murder. So you're taking, somebody murdered somebody and the state is saying, okay, I'm going to murder you next. I don't think it's any different than the murder that was initially committed.
All right, thank you, Nneka. Perhaps we can go with Rose next. What are some arguments that you have heard against the death penalty?
Well, one of the main arguments I've heard are religious arguments. A lot of people would say, well, the state is basically playing God, and they're determining who lives and who dies. And it's interesting that we discussed moral and religious arguments in favor of the death penalty, where a lot of people would also say that, if the government shouldn't kill anyone, things like that you can't really right that wrong. And also what Nneka discussed with the inhumane treatment. And I remember I was watching, I think, the Innocence Files. It was a documentary on the Innocence Project in the US, and the amount of people that they helped to exonerate, who some were on the death row, and it was just bizarre. Like, it was simple things, and it had to do with the racial bias that exists in the US. But it was just simple things that got these people free. And imagine sitting down in a cell for 20 years, not knowing when you're going to be killed. Like, imagine that type of mental frustration on someone, and then they're now, you know, back into society. But then, so that's basically the two main arguments that I would say people say against death penalty.
All right. Thank you, Rose. Pete, would you like to go next?
Yeah, okay, that'll be fine. I think a lot of arguments against it. She outlined you have the religious argument, whether or not it would be beneficial, or you're not playing God, so you can't be able to, as and adding to what Nneka had said, it indicated that in the human rights aspect, we all have human rights, whether we once we're alive, and it's inalienable, meaning that we cannot be separated from us. So even if you're a convicted felon or an inmate in prison, you are still afforded human rights, and those human rights should not be abrogated, meaning breached or taken away. The right to your freedom in relation to when you're incarcerated, it's just subjected because you also infringed upon another right and it was justifiable. However, within um, the prison, you still have fundamental rights, but not the right to freedom. The fundamental right to freedom is the right to life. One of the eight things that you have the right to life, and because you do not know when you're going to die, you know that you've been sentenced to death. However, you do not know when you're going to die. The human rights activists had advocated to say that this mental anguish, it is worse than um, something. You're just being put there and unaware which day. And as she outlined in her anecdote, that would mean psychological breakdown for anyone. Another proponent that I would say that is against the death penalty argument is why, if it's on the books and if it's being executed, how is it that not crime is still continuing? Crime is still continuing. Murders are still murder is still happening. So it being on the books or it being executed is not much of a deterrent. Persons are still committing crimes. So why is it that we need to execute persons for heinous crimes if people are still doing it? So that is what another argument, that is not much of a deterrent from permitting persons from still committing crimes. So there we have that as an argument that we put forward to there. And then I think the judges in some of their rulings, they're looking at it as that death is such a punishment, so severe that it takes away the individual's option of being rehabilitated, understandably. So that is why persons have been moving away, or the arguments of letting them live out their life sentences for a chance for rehabilitation is present. So those are the two additional things that I would like to add to that proponents for the arguments to have the death penalty abolished. That one, that it takes away from them being rehabilitated, and secondly, it is not much of a deterrent. It being present or it not being present, people will still commit crimes. So the severity of it, regardless of the murder, should not be a means for someone's life to be taken. And those are the arguments that persons have presented against it.
All right. Thank you, Pete. Kadeem, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, I think Pete raised a very interesting interesting point there, and that is, we have the death penalty on the books, and is it actually serving as a deterrent? And it's weird because I think the automatic response to someone who is an antagonist or pro the penalty would be, what if we remove it and then we see a spike in murders or serious crimes? I think that is the automatic retort to that view. Of course, I have my own personal views on the death penalty and its utility. But I think individuals out there are still supportive, are thinking that perhaps if we were to remove it, we'd see a sort of the dam break and people say, hey, it's not there, I'm not going to die, I can serve my life in prison And that would be it.
Fair point, fair point. One of the points Pete would have raised, I think it's important for us to explore it. So he would have mentioned that human rights, and persons often throw in human rights when they're speaking on the death penalty. So I know he would have mentioned the right to life, but if Rosemary or even Pete could give us some examples of what specific rights are people referencing when they say they're infringing on our human rights by having the death penalty? What specific rights are they speaking about? Rose or Pete, any one of you could take it.
Right. I'll let Rose go first since it's last.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Apart from the right to life, the other right that individuals would be speaking about is protection from inhumane treatment, which is in our Constitution, Section 7. And it says, no person shall be subjected to torture or to inhumane or degrading punishment or other such treatment. So what Nneka had explained earlier with the last person who's on the death row, his name is Lawrence Conwell. Yes. Him being fitted for a coffin. I'm not sure if it's Joseph and Boyce or Patton in the case. I'm speaking about something completely different. But I remember a case where we were told, like, the day before, you're gonna be killed tomorrow. And then when tomorrow came, you already well like tomorrow came, no. So that type of treatment and in persons on death row for a long period of time, including Patton Morgan, that the Privy Council said, someone can't be on death row for more than 5 years. So having persons on death row for an extended period of time, that is against inhumane treatment.
All right. Yes, thank you, Rose. Pete, apart from the right to life and the right to not face any inhumane treatments, are there any other specific human rights that they're referencing, or would it be those two?
Well, we start that the rights or international human rights really developed after World War II. Sorry, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated across most persons because of the atrocities of World War II. So most persons then we developed. Then we went into the era of the 60s, where we codified them into international human and civil rights. And then now we move towards constitutions being made, and as Rosemary outlined in the Constitution of Antigua and Barbuda 1981, that right is still present. Yes, we have several rights, but more specifically the death penalty. The only right that anybody would be speaking about would be the right to life, and the right to not, and to some extent, death penalty is an aspect of capital punishment, and that is also it would take into consideration the right not to be tortured and the right for your life to not be taken away.
I noticed you guys would have mentioned that our right to life as well as to not face inhumane treatment is in our constitution, in Antigua and Barbuda's constitution. But do you think there is a contrast between general international perspectives and laws and general local perspective and laws? Do you think there's a contrast, or are we on the same wavelength? Bruce.
I wouldn't say we're on the same level because because Antigua is not signed on to the Inter-American Human Rights Court, does not have jurisdiction in Antigua. So I think it was in the Joseph and Boyce case in Barbados we were able to file a claim, do all of that, but we won't be able to do that specifically. However, because we're signed on, because we're member states of the OAS and the UN, there's certain human rights, obligations that we have to take into consideration. However, there are certain treaties the name is not coming to me. I should have written it down. But there's a certain treaty, I think, against the death penalty that we're not signed onto. And, you know, that means that we're not on the same level as, you know, other international countries. But even though that is the case, there are avenues for individuals to address through our local governments, and most likely because of case law, because of the precedent that has been set with the Privy Council in Pratt law, it's likely that persons won't be staying in such inhumane periods of time on the death row.
Okay, all right. Thank you for explaining that for us, Rose. Now I have a question specifically for Nneka. Now we've spoken on the death penalty, we've spoken on arguments in favor, arguments against, but I'm curious as to things that could affect sentencing, like factors that could possibly affect whether or not a person faces the death penalty. So my question to you, Nneka, is do you think gender biases can affect sentencing in cases where the death penalty is on the table?
Yes, definitely, actually. In my research for, to touch up my talking points on this, I found, are you guys hearing me? Yes?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
Okay, sorry. Yes, in my research, I found that, well, we don't really have that kind of research in the Caribbean. There's a paucity of research in the Caribbean about gender biases and the death penalty. I don't think there's ever been a woman put to death in Antigua and Barbuda. I cannot speak for the wider Caribbean. But there was a study that was done in California, and I guess it was replicated throughout the contiguous 50 states of the US. And they said that juries were very hesitant to put women to death. Even in our own legislation, you are not allowed to execute a woman that is pregnant. So that bias, there's misplaced chivalry in this bias, in that they don't see women as deserving of such a cruel and unusual punishment. So there is awareness that it is a cruel and unusual punishment, but they're saying that women do not deserve that kind of punishment. So you would find that women who have committed crimes that are eligible for the death penalty, they're not going to receive that death penalty. Juries have been hesitant in the United States to apply that sentence. They would rather commit the person to a life sentence. As I said, there is just a paucity of information about about the application of the death penalty to women. But as I said, I don't think there have ever been any women executed in Antigua and Barbuda. So that is the gender bias in terms of men and women. I guess there's also no evidence. There's also no evidence that I could find. There's no data that I could find that determines whether or not this misplaced chivalry would apply to trans women. I don't know that the jury would say, hey, this is a woman, she does not deserve the death penalty because there's rampant transphobia present in our Caribbean islands as an attitude. So again, there was no data that I could find, or to see whether or not a trans woman would be treated as a man because they don't believe that the person is a woman. So yeah, that is how the gender biases function in the application in this handing down of the death penalty.
All right, thank you for that, Nneka. So we can pick up from what you're saying, basically, that women are less likely or completely unlikely to face the death penalty in Antigua. Now, with that in mind, how can homophobia, as well as the gender biases and maybe even LGBTQ plus biases, affect sentencing outcomes? Is it a case where they say, okay, the perpetrator is a female, the victim is a homosexual man? How would these biases affect sentencing?
Can I jump in there? as
For
a
sure, you
criminal
can go before Nick.
yeah, as a criminal practitioner, sentencing I should outline that is for the judge, and the judge does not see certain biases. We wouldn't need that. Wouldn't what they focus on it would be the mitigating and the aggravating factors or features within the matter. Meaning that they would look at the seriousness of the crime, how the crime was committed, what led to the crime um, to happen. Was it premeditated? Was it some sort of out of passion? Was there aspects of violence? What type of weapon was used? And those are the factors. I think a recent sentencing, I think the murder that happened in Potters, I think the name, I'm not too certain of the name, I don't want to say it, uh, where in which the persons involved were considered as lovers and they were of the same sex. In that manner, the judge did not focus and on any issue of their gender bias or any form of homophobia. Uh, the judge just looked at the things before her and made a decision, especially where they realized that the relationship was a bit abusive. The relationship was a bit constant fighting between both parties, and the argument that was put before the court in the sentence, which is a partial defense where it comes on to any form of murder, was provocation, and where persons are, trying to defend themselves or after they were something evoked, so a movement of passion, where they fell below the standard of reasonable thinking and acted by virtue of that, uh, then that would come under whether or not the sentence would be less. What we need to understand as well, where it comes on to the death penalty, um, the category, which is still on the book under Section 3, um, Section 3 would of the Offences Against the Persons Act, amended legislation 2013, and then Section 4 brought to bear the how sentence should be guided, is that it has to be within the most serious category, the worst of the worst of crimes, the worst of the worst, meaning that the crime committed was so egregious that no other alternative that should be given or no other sentence can be passed other than that of the death penalty. And that is the context we have to remember. Yes, it is there, it is present, but it has not been executed. It's not totally abolished. It is present, but it has not been executed because of the legal arguments that have been put forward before. But I think Rosemary had established that by Pratt and Morgan, a Jamaican case from the Privy Council, and that was the issue on the constitutional aspect, saying that the delay, where an individual is on death row, that delay would have been too much, would be too far for them, because I think they were charged from 1970, they were convicted since 1979, and
Yeah.
close to 17 years after, they would not have been put on death row. Also, the Boyce and Joseph case, that is from the Barbados Appeal Courts, which is the Privy Council. After they finished their Court of Appeal, it went on to the Privy Council, and they also established that it within those contexts that it has to be in such a severe manner. Okay,
Okay.
that is what we need to be mindful of in relation to the death penalty being present. And I'm saying that since been practicing here, especially in the criminal courts, and where sentencing is involved or where sentencing is done, where murders are being committed, and I can give the one example of the individual who
Okay. Well,
and
I really want to give Nneka an
no,
opportunity
no, no.
to also
Yeah,
answer the
I know.
question.
I was just wanted to put that into perspective. That the
Okay.
only example that I can recall where an
Okay.
individual had considered homophobic things, then it was there. But the judge did not at any point in time. There wouldn't be any bias by the judge when passing sentence. I just wanted to add that.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you for sharing your perspective, Pete. Nneka, would you mind if I repeat the question one more time for you?
Yes, please.
Okay, so how can homophobia, gender biases, LGBTQ plus biases affect sentencing outcomes? How do you think it would affect sentencing outcomes in your opinion?
Okay. So earlier when I had mentioned the juries deciding the sentence, I was speaking on it from a US perspective because that is where the data that we have comes from. I'm aware that the judge is the one who deals with the sentencing in the Caribbean, which is why, I was speaking about it from a US perspective, where you're seeing the jury biases when it comes to persons in the LGBTQ community, whether or not they feel that, because this person is a trans woman, then that person would deserve the death penalty if they have committed murder because they do not view them as a woman, where that misplaced chivalry would not get applied to that trans woman's case. So regarding biases, homophobia or transphobia, those sorts of biases, how those would affect sentencing, I think we can still apply that to a judge feeling that, a trans woman is not a woman, and they then deserve, if the death penalty is applicable, they should receive that sentence. That can be a form of bias, and there would be nothing legally preventing the judge from saying, hey, this person is not recognized as a woman legally in Antigua and Barbuda, so therefore they are a man. And I mean, it wouldn't be a reasoning for them getting the death penalty, obviously. But that would not be a bias that would be readily challenged. We still have rampant homophobia and rampant transphobia in Antigua and Barbuda. And we saw that when the death of Angel, Angel was murdered by her boyfriend. And there were the comments that that you saw coming from the public about whether or not she deserved it because she was, I mean, I don't want to repeat what they were saying, but whether or not she deserved it because she was trans. There was a lot of that. I'm not saying that a judge would, cave to public perception, but I'm saying that there are people with these biases and judges are not exempt from holding their own biases. So it could be, again, there is no data from the Caribbean regarding whether or not these homophobic biases how they play into sentencing. But I'm saying this is how that would play out. That's how it would play out if the judge was transphobic or homophobic. That's how it could play out. The leniency that would be lent to a woman, or the leniency that would be lent to a woman, a cisgendered woman, would not be granted to a trans woman.
Okay, and with that in mind, if there is even a chance that it could affect sentencing, how can, existing public LGBTQ plus biases affect the entire legal process, if it is that it could affect sentencing?
Are you talking about maybe a jury finding the person guilty because of That is an interesting question. I would really like to, not that I would like to see that play out. I would have to see that play out. I'm sure I'd have to go digging to see, and we're not privy to the deliberations of the jury because those are privileged communications. We're not allowed, we don't have access to them. So we're not really going to see whether or not those biases would play out, or, if a person was homosexual and they committed a crime. We're not going to see whether or not somebody felt, oh, well, he is a so-and-so X, Y, and Z slur. This is what they deserve. We're not going to see that. You're going to see that from the public. That's what you're going to see from the public. And they're entitled to say those, well, yes, they're entitled to say those things, but whether or not what role that would play in the deliberations of the jury, we're not going to be privy to that. So what we can do, Intersect, our organization, we have been advocating for the equal treatment of persons in the LGBTQ community. And we've been trying to, addressing homophobic and transphobic sentiments that we see. We spoke about the fact that, Angel's murder, we consider that gender-based violence, and just because we consider that gender-based violence, so we address that. So that's the role that I envision other LGBTQ advocacy groups doing. we have been, as I said, combating the homophobic and transphobic attitudes that are persistent in society. And whether or not, and again, as I said, whether or not that would play out in a deliberation in a jury, I don't know to what extent it would. I can't say for sure because there's no data.
Okay, fair enough. I'm checking the Facebook chat to see if we have any questions, but I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to ask another question. I've heard probably at least all of the panelists mention that, we haven't had someone face the death penalty in over 20 years. And my question is, what factors may have contributed to Antigua and Barbuda not having someone face the death penalty in over 20 years? And I want to start from Kadeem because he's been quiet for a little while.
But as Pete mentioned, I think RoseMary as well, that Morgan case from 1991, I think. No, sorry, that Pratt Morgan case in general. Sorry, Antigua only our last execution was in 1991, but the Pratt Morgan case is what I think has been preventing or limiting the powers of the judiciary as it relates to the death penalty. As you realize, in our jurisdiction, someone will wait umpteen years before they see the gallows. And that in itself is inhumane. You're talking about upwards of 10 years sitting in a jail, thinking about when you will have your last breath. And I don't know that is something that I would want anyone to live through. So I think ultimately that has been the main thing, the main contributor to us not seeing the death penalty actually carried out in our lifetime. Well, I think Nneka and Pete, they have been toddlers when we had our last death penalty. I think we were around the same age. So
We won.
We
one, exactly.
I'm
So
92.
yeah, I
I'm not
don't
that
think
far off.
that.
I'm 92, so I'm not far off. I'm not
So
old.
yes, I don't know that we will see it happen in our lifetime, given that case, and many people have not seen it.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Kadeem. Rose, what factors do you think account for us not having someone face the death penalty in over 20 years?
Apart from what Kadeem would have just talked about with the case and a better understanding and more accessibility to the law, I think also we have to remember the day and age that we're in, that social media is, very important in our lives. And 20 years ago, we would not have had access to Twitter. There's no Facebook, there's no Instagram. So, and also we have to think about how do we execute these persons. It was through hanging. It was hanging, right? Yeah. So the last execution that Antigua had, they hanged the individual. Imagine if that was to happen in 2020. And if persons were to have social media campaigns and also, raise a lot of awareness online, raise a lot of awareness in the Caribbean, and also the international, media to get wind of this, that Antigua is, hanging someone. Like, this is the 21st century, this is 2020, someone is doing that. So I think because of the negative stigma that, international countries have on death penalty, and also even though I think the US is the only first world country that still has capital punishment. I may be wrong, but I know the UK abolished it and the US still does it, but they do it through lethal injections. So if we're doing that in 2020, we're hanging someone, that's gonna be a field day. So I think because of the negative stigma that is associated with, capital punishments and hanging individuals, I think that is another reason why that has not been done. And also how, I don't want to say, I guess practical, because if you look up, apart from the death penalty, when you look at our prison in itself, I've seen international news media houses describe our prison as a human rights violation. And I've never seen it. I've never been there. I hope I never go there. But from the stories that I've heard, it sounds, it sounds very devastating. So I don't think that we have the mechanisms or the resources to ensure, well, not ensure like we have to do this, but for if someone gets a death penalty sentence, for them to be put to death within the 5-year period that Pratt and Morgan has set for us. So I don't think that we have the resources to get that done. I don't think we have the resources for us to have lethal injections, because that cannot be cheap. So I think because we don't have those facilities also in place, that they just avoid it completely.
Fair enough. Pete, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, I would just add that is, the factors really are just twofold: the legal factor as well as the social factor. The legal factor would be the issue of the cases establishing what you call a jurisprudence, or most the legal fraternity across the Commonwealth Caribbean, we having the same models, the same judicial system, have adopted that approach. And the factor that social factor, which I would put it, is that there has been, or I should say that the murders that have been committed, or what I should say in Antigua, would not have reached the threshold that the legal barrier would be looking for, which is the worst of the worst, or within the most serious of that is a category that they look forward to. The torture aspect of it as well, because once you're supposed to execute the death penalty, human rights indicate that the person shouldn't suffer. Um, so it should be quick and should be painless. In America, if the individual suffers, or if the execution of the injection of the person is injected with the serum and nothing happens, or if they suffer during it and they come back alive, that person walks free, because that, yes, that's what happened, because then they would have suffered, or that would have failed ultimately. So the executioner would have been a violation of the individual's human right, because they would have at least suffered, or they would have endured pain during the execution of the serum. So those two factors really have brought to bear, um, in our context of the Caribbean, why we don't have the continuation of the even though it's still on the books, we don't have the continuation of the execution of the death penalty.
All right, thank you, Pete. And Nneka, what about you? Do you think, what factors? Nneka,
Oh,
you're muted.
her mic is off.
Sorry, the dogs are turning up outside, so I have to mute them. I think another factor, I'm not sure if this is anecdotal, but I do believe that after the last execution in 1991, Sir James Carlisle would have refused, because I do believe the Governor General had to sign the warrant to execute a prisoner. And I believe that after that last execution, he refused to sign anymore. And I don't think I don't think any subsequent governors general have signed any execution warrants. So I think that also plays into the social factor that RoseMary was talking about. Pete was talking about. I think both of them spoke about it. I think that is one of the social factors that that's where you're seeing the public opinion actually influencing a decision maker. I believe they realize that, that would make them very unpopular. That is one of the factors, I think. And also the Privy Council ruling that the death penalty was unconstitutional. I can't remember the name of the case, but there was a ruling that the death penalty was unconstitutional. So I think that's another factor as well that plays into it. And I'm just going to reiterate what RoseMary said. It's not a very popular thing. People, besides the family members, wanting retribution and revenge, I'm not sure that, a large amount of population, and I believe Kadeem would have said it before, that people don't really care for the death penalty, and we only have a discussion about it when a case that is particularly heinous, that we think is particularly heinous, that is when you're going to hear the family members speaking about the death penalty. But otherwise, I don't really think people are, I haven't really heard any active proponents for the death penalty for a very long time. I could be wrong, but I personally have not heard anybody saying, we need a death penalty, we need to keep this on the books, it's just there because there's no political will to have it removed from off the books, I believe. So I just think that is the reason why we haven't had any executions for the last 20 odd years, well, 29 years.
Can I interject here?
Sure.
Okay, so very recently, again, I did have a discussion on the death penalty on my own radio program, and that became fodder for what happened, like the talk shows the week after, and there were quite a few people who supported the death penalty, and I wonder now reflecting upon some of the things that they said, I wonder if we get to a point where we have a situation where it is clean cut. It is clear cut that this person committed this heinous act. It was the worst of the worst. And we have a groundswell of people who believe that they should be executed. Not only that, we have the political will. The people will manifests in that way. And we have seen in the past how political pressure forces our administration and our judiciary, etc., to find the resources that RoseMary spoke about that we never had the resources for, or to rush to the parliament to ensure that the legislative framework is there to sort of allow for this act to happen. So I wonder if there's a huge terrorist act or something absolutely heinous happens, if there won't be enough individuals out there who, in our Christian society, believe that the death penalty has its place. If we see it happening, I honestly wonder about that, given what we have experienced in the past with respect to political pressure and the response to our political directorate to that pressure.
All right, thank you, Kadeem, for that. So I'm now checking the time, and I'm realizing that we are a bit over time. But I will give you guys an opportunity to just say any final thoughts that you may have, or any last point that you would like to mention just before I wrap up. Okay, so maybe we can start with Pete. Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, the only final thoughts I have, I asked individuals from reasonable man, who were not really in the legal fraternity, what are their thoughts on the death penalty. The two questions are reasonable woman. Most of them say yes, it should be present, but it should be qualitative, or it should have qualifications with it, meaning that where it's irrefutable evidence or irrefutable grounds where this person has committed these acts. One of them even said, even for rape, it should be not limited to murder, but include that offense. Then there are strong proponents for it. Being within the legal framework and see how appeals and innocence before proven guilty and all those aspects. Personally, I'm not for the death penalty. We have moved too much and too forward, and also being involved in international human rights myself, doing it at school and faculty, I've understood and seen how it has taken its bearings and its necessity it needs, especially for inmates, when rehabilitation is a means. And I said, if the Lord can forgive, if why can't we? And that's what I'm saying on that.
All right, thank you, Pete. RoseMary, any final thoughts?
So basically, I'm also not for the death penalty, but we did raise a very interesting scenario. And if something like that was to happen, I really could see what I want to say is that I really want us as a country, as a society, to focus on rehabilitation offenders and also fixing factors that create because there are a lot of things that would really, and you know, when I look at, because I love watching crime documentaries, and there's this other series I don't remember the name, but they would interview person from death row, and every like the main factor, you know, I live a life of crime from since I was really young. That doesn't have to be the case for every recurring factor, and they've been doing all this time. So it's not like okay, they jumped from upstairs into this whole pattern. So if we can identify those persons in society and help them along the way, provide actual, you know, rehabilitation for them so that they do not end up committing heinous crime. So that's the hope that I have there. And yes, it's good to have these discussions, but I really wish that
I'm sorry, Rosemary, I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you. I think, Nneka, if you mute your mic,
Okay.
Rosemary will be a little clearer.
Okay. Y'all can hear me fine. Okay. So basically, I was saying that I really would like for us, like these discussions are important, they are useful, but I would really like for us to start discussing, addressing the factors that do create criminals and do create, or the system itself that allows people to continually commit, you know, small petty crimes and then basically upgrade into more heinous crimes. So I feel like if we can address that first, and try to fix the system that we have in place, try to fix, you know, create resources for these people, for people so that they do not have to, you know, end up in that place, then, you know, that's basically what I want to see.
All right, thank you, Rosemary. Kadeem, any final thoughts?
I think if I leave anything with those listening, it would be, well, at least for me, I've always been against the death penalty. I think my first introduction to the idea of the death penalty was when September 11th, 2001, when the Twin Towers were bombed. I remember very distinctly, social studies teacher asked if we as students back then were put in that place, what would we do? How would we feel as family members concerning the terrorists? And I have never felt that someone should be executed because of an act. And even now, I still question whether as a human, a human being, we have the moral prowess, the moral fortitude to determine whether anyone else should die. I don't think that decision is vested in any one person or any group of persons. I remember Terence, who was a Roman African playwright, said, "I am human, and nothing human can be alien to me," which means or suggests that as a human, any act that another human commits is something that inherently I can do. I can murder someone in a fit of rage. And I don't think that, as I said, any human being should have the moral grounds to determine what happens to another life. It is not our responsibility. Whether, if you look at it through a religious lens, the Bible says the Lord should be the final judge. Let him be the final judge. If you look at it from just general morality, I honestly don't think that any person has that right. I think that's where I stand on this matter.
All right, thank you, Kadeem. And last but not least, Nneka, any final thoughts?
Just that, you know, as a feminist, as a radical feminist, I would like to see our justice system move away from something that is considered carceral and punitive, and we focus more on restorative and transformative justice. I like Rosemary's point where we speak about, you know, addressing the factors that lead people to become to be the perpetrator in the criminal justice system. You know, more outreach programs, focuses on mental health, addressing factors that have to do with broken families, things like that. And I'd also like to focus on more of the healing I would also like our justice system to evolve where we focus on more of the healing aspect of justice and what that looks like. And we do a deep dive on what on what we have been taught that justice should be look like from our former colonial masters. Our justice system is very much a hand-me-down of our former colonial owners. That is what we inherited, and we still uphold it. Even now, as you have in the Nigel Christian case, you had a UK institution who would have handed down our very ideas of justice tell us that, you know, they're not going to offer any assistance unless we can say that the death penalty will not be pursued. So it was kind of, for me, it was kind of hypocritical, because I'm just like, this is what we inherited. Your country is the one that put this in place. And although I don't disagree at all with what they're saying, because I'm definitely against the death penalty. I just found it a little bit hypocritical that, you know, you have the UK telling us, hey, we're not going to help you if you have the death penalty, if you're going to be pursuing the death penalty. So I do want us to do more of a deep dive into recognizing where our systems come from, what impacts they've had on us, on our families, on our communities, how we relate to each other, and how we view justice. So that is something I'm hoping I will see in my lifetime. I'm going to continue to push for it, but that's the final word that I have to say. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, thank you, Nneka. Once again, today's panel discussion was organized with the support of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, funded by the European Union. So we want to say thanks to them for trusting us to spearhead this project. I'd also like to take the time to thank our panel, our wonderful panel, because we literally could not do this without you. I know each of you lead very busy lives, so we're appreciative of you being willing to share your time, your expertise, all of that good stuff with us. So thank you, RoseMary, Nneka, Kadeem, and Pete so much. I'd also in particular like to thank one of the founders of Amplify, Ms. Ashanti O'Keefe, because her assistance with this panel discussion was invaluable. I want to say thank you to the people who sign on and the people who will sign on, afterwards when they see the Facebook Live pop up. And just being eager and willing to learn. We appreciate you so much. And I'd like to thank anyone else who would have contributed to the success of this panel discussion, whether that may have been, sharing a flyer or just telling us, oh, good luck, I hope it goes well. We see you, we appreciate you. And with that being said, I hope everyone is able to enjoy the rest of their night and their weekend. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Lehana.
Thanks.
No problem.